My wife's best friend called me and said she was going to the company couple's dinner with her lover. I remember the exact sensation that ran through me at that moment. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just pain. It was an internal combustion, as if the ground had cracked beneath my feet and the fall would be eternal. My heart raced, but my mind froze, as if refusing to believe it. She had said it was a casual celebration, something between colleagues, just an informal, unpretentious dinner. I trusted her. I always trusted her. And perhaps that was my biggest mistake. I grabbed my keys without thinking. I didn't take my wallet or my cell phone. Just the impulse. Just the pain in my chest as fuel. I remember the entire drive, the noise of the cars, the honking horns, everything blending into a background hum. My focus was on her. It was the image of her smiling at another man. It was the lie she'd told, looking into my eyes hours earlier. She'd left the house dressed discreetly, almost too casual for someone claiming to be going to a simple get-together. And I, idiot, had even commented on how beautiful she looked. She smiled. She said thank you. And gave me a lingering kiss, the kind you only give to someone you still want to keep close. As I parked near the venue, something inside me still hoped it was a misunderstanding. I wanted it all to be a mistake, that my trust hadn't been betrayed. But it didn't take long. As soon as I entered the side of the dining room, where the windows revealed part of the interior, the truth exploded in my face. She was there. Sitting at a table with another man, dressed in a dress she hadn't worn in years, the one she always said she saved for special occasions. She laughed, touched his arm intimately, her eyes shining in a way they didn't when she spoke to me. I saw myself there, outside, my heart pounding in my chest, and the two of them, as if they were the protagonists of a story that never belonged to me. She never mentioned it would be a couple's dinner. On the contrary, she made a point of saying everyone would be going alone. And then, in that moment, I understood, I had been erased. Forgotten. Replaced. I went home without saying anything. Without calling. Without texting. I didn't want to hear excuses, lame excuses, or that old line about, it wasn't what I was thinking. It was over. I saw it. I felt it. I got home and went straight to my room. I started packing my things, folding each piece of clothing like someone wrapping up a story. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just wrote a letter. A simple letter thanking her for everything we'd experienced, for the memories, the trips, the smiles, and saying it was time to move on. That she could finally experience the freedom she so desperately desired. And that, even though I was hurt, I hoped she would be happy. But far from me. I left the letter on the bed, packed my suitcase, and left quietly. As I closed the door to the home we'd built together, the only thing I could feel was a wrenching emptiness, as if my identity had been ripped out with my fingernails. I was the man who would do anything for her. And she was the woman who chose to live in the moment with another, even though she had everything. Even though she had someone who loved her completely. Hours later, she arrived. She found the house silent, dark, empty. The suitcase was gone. The closet was incomplete. And on the bed, the letter. She read it. Reread it. And for the first time, perhaps, she realized the gravity of what she had done. The phone rang incessantly that night. Messages, audios, calls. I didn't answer. She cried during the recordings. She said she had made a mistake. That it was just a slip-up. That she wanted to go back. That she would do anything to make amends. But some choices cannot be undone. And what she destroyed wasn't just trust, it was my image of her. It was our history. I disappeared for weeks. I had to rebuild myself in silence, away from everything that reminded me of her. I changed my routine. I avoided the places we used to go. I deleted photos, messages, videos. I began trying to relearn how to live for myself. And little by little, I found peace in what seemed unbearable. It was then, one random afternoon, that fate decided to strike back. A mutual friend invited us both to the same event. A wedding. And there she was. Alone. Emotionally distraught, trying to hide her anguish behind a wry smile. Her eyes scanned the room as if searching for something, or someone. And then, she saw me. I walked in accompanied. Not just anyone. But someone who made me rediscover what it meant to be affection without ulterior motives, love without demands, presence without distrust. Someone who, in just a few months, made me feel more valued than my ex-wife had in years. She stared at me with teary eyes. She tried to get closer. She murmured my name in the middle of the ceremony. I just smiled. And when she tried to get closer, I extended my hand like someone greeting a distant acquaintance. It was a blow. An impact. She recoiled. She tried to hold back the tears. But it was clear, for the first time, she understood what it was like to lose. What it was like to watch someone move on without you. What it was like to see the love of your life loved by another. What she didn't know, is that that night, before going to sleep, I read again the letter I left on my bed. And I smiled. Because I hadn't just overcome it. I had won. And there's something she can never erase, the moment she saw me happy, and knew she would never be a part of my happiness again. But the most curious thing of all came after that wedding, when a message arrived from an unexpected number. A revelation that put the whole story into perspective. Something I never imagined, but which explains everything she did. Something that can make even the most spiteful of hearts hesitate for a second before hating. But that part can only be told calmly. Because sometimes, what seems like a simple betrayal, is just the tip of the iceberg of something much bigger. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize any form of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but reflect real and emotional situations that show, in depth, how betrayal destroys lives, families and hearts. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is an intense story, charged with emotional truth and full of unexpected consequences. Sit back, and prepare for a shocking story. Jonathan and Helena were, in everyone's eyes, the reflection of a life built on respect, admiration, and the kind of love that, though discreet, seemed unshakable. Married for almost 10 years, they lived in a 2-story house in a quiet, leafy neighborhood, where neighbors saw them as an exemplary couple, always smiling during casual street encounters, participating in community parties, and offering support to those in need. There was harmony in the little things, the coffee he made every morning, the flowers she still enjoyed receiving as surprises, the notes they left for each other around the house, as if they were still dating. But what few knew was that the beauty of their relationship didn't come from chance, but from a mutual effort, an effort that, over the years, began to weigh more heavily on one side than the other. Jonathan was a methodical, patient, and generous man. He worked as a financial consultant, had fixed hours, established habits, and an admirable dedication to stability. He was the type who preferred to resolve arguments through dialogue, who made a point of listening, who noted special dates and remembered every detail of their life together. Since they married, he had made it his personal mission to ensure Helena's peace of mind, both financially and emotionally. She, on the other hand, was pure intensity. A publicist, creative, spontaneous, she had an almost restless energy that enchanted everyone. She was passionate about art, fashion, travel, and long conversations about everything and nothing. If Jonathan was the anchor, Helen was the wind. And for many years, this difference became precisely what kept them balanced. The couple's routine was like a silent choreography that repeated itself fluidly. On weekdays, they divided their time between work and relaxation together, homemade dinners, TV shows on the couch, wine on the weekends. On Sundays, a trip to the organic market was almost a ritual, followed by a light lunch in the backyard, where they would chat about the week's news or plans for the future. Helena loved imagining what life would be like in another city, another country perhaps, and Jonathan, though more down-to-earth, allowed himself to dream with her. There was a natural tenderness in the way he looked at her when she spoke excitedly about projects or far-fetched ideas. And there was something almost childlike in her eyes when he surprised her with something simple, like a piece of candy left in the car or a ticket to a play she'd mentioned weeks before. To their friends, they seemed perfect. The few who were closest knew that, as in any lasting relationship, there were differences and difficult phases, but the way they handled them was admirable. Instead of arguments, there was respectful silence. Instead of accusations, there were pauses for reflection. Jonathan believed that love was made of commitment, and Helena said that love was made of enchantment. And the two, with some effort, found a way to unite these two truths. It was precisely because of this mutual care, this continued respect, that no one, absolutely no one, could have imagined that their story was about to enter its darkest phase. In the last few months, something subtle began to change. There was no shouting, no obvious distancing, but there was silence where there had once been conversation. Jonathan began to notice small absences, changes in behavior that, though subtle, generated an almost imperceptible unease. Helena was more distracted, sometimes zoned out during dinner, her gaze lost even when he was present. The love notes disappeared, and Sundays in the backyard were replaced by commitments she claimed were work-related. Jonathan, with his measured demeanor, tried not to theorize. He preferred to believe it was a phase. That perhaps she was overwhelmed, or seeking new professional stimulation. He still made breakfast, still bought flowers, still waited for her at the gate when she was late arriving. And he still told her he loved her every night, even when she responded with only a hurried kiss on the forehead. Helena, for her part, seemed to be living on two levels. On the surface, she maintained the gestures that sustained the image of the perfect couple. She responded to Jonathan's messages affectionately, gave him occasional compliments, and smiled in photos. But internally, she struggled with a diffuse sense of restlessness, as if something were out of place, as if a part of her had been asleep for a long time. The comfort of that life that had once seemed so dreamy now felt like a bubble. She missed passion, surprise, feeling desired in a way that was not only gentle but urgent. Jonathan's love was stable, secure, respectful, and, in her eyes, it was beginning to feel routine, too predictable. She tried to fight this thought, feeling ungrateful for thinking this way, but she was honest enough with herself not to ignore what pulsed through her mind during the sleepless nights. Around that time, she began to grow closer to some of her co-workers, accepting invitations to social events she'd previously declined. Jonathan encouraged her. He always thought it was important for her to maintain her autonomy, her own space, her own moments. He himself had never been the controlling type. He trusted her completely. It was this trust, in fact, that hurt her most in the moments of guilt that arose without her knowing exactly why. The feeling of being absent within a still-present relationship is a kind of anguish that consumes her silently. And Helena, even though she loved Jonathan in her own way, felt distant from him, as if they were living in different times. The house they lived in, once filled with laughter and sounds, gradually grew quieter. There were no arguments, I repeat, no shouting, and perhaps that's why nothing seemed wrong to the outside world. But something had slowly broken. Not dramatically. But like a glass that cracks silently and only reveals the crack when light hits it at the right angle. And the cruelest thing is that Jonathan couldn't see the crack. On the contrary, he believed he was experiencing a moment of tranquility. After so many professional ups and downs, he had finally gotten a promotion, was planning a short trip with Helena, and was even considering the idea of having children. In his eyes, they were entering a new phase, more mature, more solid. He was even tending the garden, thinking about installing a hammock on the porch. Helena smiled when he mentioned these things. But it was a distant smile, more polite than genuine. Her closest friends noticed the change in her radiance, but interpreted it as stress. And he, always so centered, saw no harm in her new phase. Especially because, in his mind, it was natural for couples to go through moments like this. There were cycles. And he was willing to wait. To give space. To understand. Because he loved. He loved deeply. In a way that doesn't scream. In a way that proves itself day after day. He sincerely believed that every lasting relationship required patience, generosity, and time. But some stories aren't interrupted by a lack of love. They're interrupted by excessive silence, by accumulated carelessness, by words that weren't said in time. And by decisions that, once made, can't be undone. Everything seemed to be following a natural course until that day. A seemingly ordinary day. Bright sunshine, normal work commitments, text messages exchanged in the morning. Jonathan left early, leaving the car for her to use, as he always did when she said she needed it. He left lunch half prepared, as he did on Fridays, and a note on the mirror, "Tonight, just the two of us. Special dinner. Love you." He received no reply. And he didn't suspect it. He went about his day calmly, unaware that, just a few blocks away, the story he believed he was living was about to take a definitive turn. A turn that didn't begin that day, but that, on that day, would take shape. Gain weight. And open the first irreversible rift between two people who once believed that love alone would be enough. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon, casually, almost unpretentiously. A colleague of Helena's, excited about the new role some of her colleagues had taken on the team, mentioned a get-together dinner. She used the expression, couples dinner, without emphasis, as if throwing information into the wind. Helena hesitated at first. Jonathan wasn't very sociable with her work friends, he preferred more intimate events and quieter settings. It was a dinner for couples, but that could mean anything. Still, when she mentioned it to him, she chose her words carefully. She preferred to say it was an informal dinner among colleagues, no chaperone necessary. Jonathan simply smiled, as always, and wished her to enjoy herself. He asked if she wanted him to pick her up later, but she politely declined, saying she'd drive back. He didn't suspect anything. He trusted her. Trust was a constant, like a silent foundation he never imagined could one day crumble. On the night of the dinner, Helena dressed up more carefully than usual. She chose an elegant dress that emphasized her figure in a discreet yet striking way. She applied her makeup, something she didn't do often, and spent more time in front of the mirror than usual. Jonathan watched her from afar, enchanted. He was still amazed by her beauty, by the way she knew how to reinvent herself, even in small details. He told her she looked beautiful. She thanked him with a quick kiss, but her eyes seemed to avoid his. She left, promising to return early, and he remained there, alone, preparing the dinner he had planned for them. The table was set, the music was soft, the wine breathed on the counter. He didn't know that that night would mark the end of something inside him. The hours passed slowly. The clock seemed to laugh at the wait. Helena didn't text or warn of delays. Jonathan tried to distract himself, but he kept returning to the window, checking to see if the car's lights would appear around the corner. Around 10:30, he began packing up. He felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain. Her absence that night was more than physical, it was symbolic. It wasn't the first time she'd seemed distant, but something was different. A nagging feeling of being left behind. Across the city, Helena smiled. She chatted, gestured, drank one glass of wine after another. She was with a man beside her, someone who wasn't her husband. Someone who made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in a long time. He touched her hand subtly but intimately. The two seemed in sync, as if there were an unresolved past there, or an intensely active present. Helena, in that environment, seemed light. As if she had disconnected, for a few hours, from everything that tied her to the reality she lived with Jonathan. Maybe it was the adrenaline of experiencing something forbidden. Maybe it was the desperate attempt to feel alive again. She danced between guilt and pleasure with a naturalness that surprised her. Even though part of her knew what she was doing, another part struggled to believe it was just a harmless distraction. But it wasn't. 2 days later, while Jonathan was washing the breakfast dishes, he received an unexpected call. It was Laura, Helena's best friend, one of those people he'd always considered trustworthy but who rarely involved herself in the couple's private life. She hesitated, apologized for calling like that, but said she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. She said she felt complicit in a lie, that she knew it could ruin a lot, but that he deserved to know. The words came dryly, bluntly. Helena had gone to the couple's dinner with another man. Not a colleague. An intimate companion. A lover. Jonathan fell silent. The water continued to run over the dishes, but he couldn't hear anything else. The floor seemed to have disappeared beneath his feet. Nausea rose like a slow poison, and his stomach twisted. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply thanked her for the call and hung up. He sat at the table, staring at the empty chair across from him. Her chair. The place where, for years, she had sat every morning, laughing with a cup of coffee in her hands. The same chair where they had discussed plans, laughed at silly jokes, and confided in each other. Now, that space seemed to scream an unbearable emptiness. The rest of the day was a blur. Jonathan left the house, drove aimlessly, stopped at a park they often frequented, and stayed there for hours. He didn't call her. He didn't confront her. He didn't seek explanations. He needed to understand what he felt before listening to any justification. It was a dry, cutting pain that didn't spread like wildfire, but froze everything. A kind of grief that you don't cry out loud, but crushes you from within. He tried to search his memory for the signs. The clues. And he felt angry at himself for not having seen. For having trusted too much. For having loved so blindly. Helena arrived home early in the evening. She found everything silent. Last night's dinner was still in the fridge. The house was clean and tidy, but there was something off. Something about the energy of the place. Jonathan wasn't there. His suitcase, however, was also missing. In the bedroom, on the bed, was an envelope. Inside, a letter. Written in his handwriting, words that overflowed with contained pain. Thank you for everything, shared memories, and a sober goodbye. He said he wasn't running away, just choosing himself for the first time in a long time. And that, despite everything, he wanted her to be happy. Helena read the letter more than once. The ground sank beneath her. Her legs trembled. The impact of losing someone who had always been there, even in the worst moments, was immediate. She ran around the house, calling him dozens of times. Long messages, tearful audio messages. No answer. The absence was more painful than any scream. That silence hurt in a way she wasn't ready to feel. In the following days, she tried every means possible to find him. She visited his usual haunts, reached out to friends, and tried to access information through work. Nothing. Jonathan had disappeared, as if his world had imploded and he was starting a new one in another dimension. To the neighbors, his absence seemed like a business trip. But to her, it was the beginning of a faceless punishment. A void that became an echo every time she entered that now lifeless house. The weeks passed with a suffocating slowness. Helena began to notice details she'd previously ignored. The absence of notes, flowers, and small kindnesses that now seemed like relics of a time she'd thrown away. There was no one to blame but herself. She began to struggle at work, missed deadlines, and avoided social contact. The forced joy of social media contrasted with the dejected expression she couldn't hide. And in the wee hours of the morning, regret became a ferocious beast, devouring any attempt to rationalize what she'd done. She had dreams about him. Dreams where everything went back to normal, where he hugged her, where they laughed together. But she woke up with a wet pillow and an empty chest. Then the wedding came. An unexpected invitation from an old friend, one of those who had known Jonathan longer than she had. At first, she considered not going. But something inside her told her she had to. Maybe she wanted to find some link that would reconnect her with the past. Maybe she wanted, even if unconsciously, to be seen. To show that she was okay, that she still existed. He spent the day getting ready with almost ritualistic care. He chose an elegant dress that made his presence felt without exaggeration. His hair tied in a classic bun, his makeup discreet but impeccable. He arrived early, greeted the guests, and smiled lightly. But his eyes betrayed an absence no one could name. And then he appeared. He entered the room serenely, confidently, accompanied by a woman she had never seen before. Beautiful, yes. But what hurt most was the way he looked at her. There was tenderness, there was radiance. Jonathan seemed light. As if he had left behind a decade of heaviness. He greeted his friends calmly, laughed with the groomsmen, and when his eyes met hers, there was no hostility. There was no anger. There was just a polite nod. A polite gesture. A polite stranger. Helena froze. She couldn't move. The whole world seemed to shrink around that scene. The man she betrayed, the man she thought was destroyed, was there. Whole. Renewed. And at peace. The pain of abandonment was replaced by something crueler, the pain of knowing he was better off without her. But what she didn't yet know was that there was something behind that serenity. Something he'd only recently discovered. A secret hidden between the lines of everything they'd experienced. Something that explained her pain, her absence, and the real reason she'd never returned. After the wedding, the days that followed were unbearable for Helena. Seeing Jonathan with another woman, so calm, so secure, so unattainable, opened a hole in her soul that nothing could fill. He didn't ignore her, but the respectful coldness with which he treated her was like a silent slap, the kind that doesn't mark the skin, but shatters it from within. The pain she felt now was different from the silent guilt that had tormented her in the previous weeks. It was a conscious, painful, and perhaps deserved mourning. It was no longer just his absence, but the realization that she had forever lost the only man who truly knew her whole self and yet chose to stay. And now, the presence of that other woman, serene, elegant, with a gentle smile, made everything seem even more final. The look he gave his new partner was filled with a quiet tenderness, a connection Helena had never experienced in her final months of marriage. This wasn't just a new relationship. It was the rebirth of someone she had destroyed and who, against all odds, had found the strength to rebuild herself. Still, she tried. One last time. She knew where he was living, because a mutual friend had dropped a comment without realizing the depth of it. It was a new apartment, away from the old neighborhood, in a discreet building. Helena didn't think twice. She got in her car and drove there with trembling hands, her heart in her throat. When she arrived, she stood outside for several minutes. She debated whether to go up, whether to simply accept that this chapter was over. But she couldn't. She rang the intercom. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Just when she was about to give up, a male voice came over the speaker. It was him. She said his name firmly, bluntly, asking for just 5 minutes. He hesitated. And then the gate opened. The elevator seemed to ascend in slow motion. When she arrived, he already had the door open, standing in the doorway, wearing a simple t-shirt, barefoot, his gaze calm but dull. She smiled softly, but didn't receive one in return. He simply stepped aside, making room for her to enter. The apartment was minimalist, clean, impersonal, as if she were starting from scratch. And perhaps she was. She tried to make small talk, talking about the wedding, the decor, the guests. He just nodded politely. Until she took a deep breath and said she needed to talk. She said she wasn't there to ask to come back, nor to justify what she'd done. She said she hadn't slept properly in weeks, that everything reminded her of him, and that, more than longing, what she felt was a deep, suffocating regret, the kind that wouldn't let up even in dreams. Jonathan remained silent for a few seconds, then pulled out a chair and sat down. Helena, standing, hesitated. And then he looked at her, fixedly, as if carrying a truth too heavy. He asked if she was there to be honest, completely honest. She said yes. He crossed his arms and asked bluntly how long ago the affair with the other man had begun. She stammered, tried to soften the words, saying it wasn't an affair, that it was a mistake, a one-night stand. But he interrupted with a short, bitter smile and said he wasn't there to hear euphemisms. He said that, days after leaving home, he had received something that changed everything. A letter. Not from a friend, nor from an acquaintance. But from someone unexpected, the wife of the man with whom she had had the affair. Helena paled. Jonathan stood and walked to a drawer, where he took out an already opened envelope. He tossed it on the table. He said the woman had found out everything months earlier but never had the courage to confront her husband. He said that after seeing the dinner scene on another guest's social media, he decided to write to Jonathan directly. He doesn't deserve to remain in the dark, the letter read. There, in that nervous, sincere handwriting, were details Helena had never told anyone. The name of the restaurant, the color of her dress, the room number of the hotel where they had spent that night. She tried to speak, but Jonathan held up his hand for silence. He said he'd read that letter about 20 times. He said that, contrary to what she might have imagined, that wasn't what hurt him most. What hurt him most was the last paragraph, where the woman revealed what truly motivated her lover to get closer to Helena. It wasn't passion. It wasn't desire. It was revenge. Years before, he'd been fired from a financial consulting firm because of a restructuring Jonathan had undertaken. There was no mistake, no injustice. It was part of a strategic decision, but the man never got over it. He kept the name, the face, the memory. And when he saw that Jonathan's wife worked at an agency that provided services for the company he'd later joined, he knew what to do. He approached Helena with calculated charm, manipulating conversations, complimenting the right points, telling her what she wanted to hear. He knew she felt neglected, and he used that. The couple's dinner was just the culmination of a slowly constructed plan. Everything was coldly calculated to hit Jonathan in the one place he would never protect himself, his heart. Helena fell to the couch, her eyes wide, her entire body trembling. She was trying to breathe, but it felt like the air was escaping her lungs. Jonathan, standing, remained firm, his voice restrained, but each word weighed like lead. He said that at that moment, as he finished reading the letter, he didn't feel anger. He felt pity. Pity for her. Pity for having let herself be involved with someone so petty. Pity for having destroyed everything for something so empty. And pity for himself, for having believed for so long in something that no longer existed. She said that the man who had waited for her at the door with flowers died there. And someone was born who, for the first time, chose not to carry guilt that wasn't his. Helena cried uncontrollably. She apologized between sobs. She said she didn't know, that she never imagined, that she was foolish, impulsive. But deep down, there was nothing more to say. Jonathan said he felt no hatred. He said that, in a way, it had all been a liberation. And that now, he knew for sure, there would be no going back. What he had experienced with her would remain, but no longer be at the forefront of his steps. He said her pain now was a reflection of the choice she had made. And that he sincerely hoped she would find a way to forgive herself. But without him. She still tried to get closer. She touched his hand. She told him she still loved him. That if he said just one word, she'd drop everything. But he just pulled his hand away, his gaze sweet and yet devastating. He said love wasn't enough when trust died. And that she'd buried it with her own hands. Leaving the apartment, Helena felt like the world was spinning in slow motion. Outside, the sun was still shining, but everything seemed dull. Jonathan's face, his words, the letter, everything hammered in her mind like a punishment that would never end. She ran down the stairs like someone fleeing a shipwreck. But she knew, it was already late. Very late. And what she couldn't have imagined was that this would be only the first blow of what was yet to come. Because fate sometimes exacts its toll, and the next blow was still hidden in silence. About to be revealed. Helena spent days in absolute silence. The revelation that her lover had approached her with ulterior motives, not true desire, was a knife that opened a new wound, deeper, more cruel. But what truly tore through was Jonathan's face when he told her. The absence of fury, the absence of revenge. It was the calm of someone who no longer suffers. It was the indifference of someone who has already accepted the loss and moved on. And this indifference weighed more heavily than any scream. She walked through the house like a ghost, touching objects, photos, old clothes, trying to grasp something that kept her connected to him, as if his presence were still hidden among the furniture, among the sheets, among the scents that had not yet faded. But everything became history with frightening speed. Her friends no longer knew what to say. Some walked away, others watched with disguised pity. And she, now alone, sank deeper and deeper into a feeling she couldn't name, between guilt, regret, and a seemingly bottomless emptiness. Jonathan, on the other hand, was slowly returning to his routine. There were difficult days, of course. There were early mornings when I still woke with my heart racing, with flashes of memories I couldn't control. But something in him had changed. His strength came not from the absence of pain, but from the firm decision not to let that pain define him. He started taking walks at dawn, something he'd never done before. He read books that Helena always recommended, but which he'd put off until later. He began writing down everything he felt in a notebook, unfiltered, unordered. It was as if he were rebuilding himself letter by letter. One day, in one of those neighborhood cafes where he used to work, he bumped into a woman who dropped her papers on the floor. Her help was instinctive, quick, and the smile he received in return was light, sincere, and unpressured. Her name was Alicia. She was a history teacher, divorced for 2 years, with a teenage daughter. The conversation that began there was casual, about books and bad coffee, but it continued, and became a habit. Alicia had a calmness unlike Helena, a serene sweetness, effortlessly trying to impress. Jonathan allowed himself to enjoy the feeling of being listened to without rushing, of laughing without having to explain himself. It was too early to talk about deep feelings, but there was something there. And he knew it. Meanwhile, Helena tried to repair what no longer existed. She wrote letters she never sent, rehearsed confessions to friends, sought therapists, and sought spirituality. But every attempt at redemption ran up against reality. Jonathan had moved on. Not with anger, not with revenge. But with freedom. And this destroyed her. One night, he decided to seek out the wife of the man with whom he had the affair. He wanted to understand more. To know what she knew. He found the address easily, a simple house in a remote neighborhood. He knocked on the door, unsure of what to say. When the woman opened the door, he was speechless for a few seconds. Until finally, she gave her name and asked for forgiveness. The woman stared at her for a few seconds, then made room and asked her to come in. The living room was modest, with pictures of children on the wall. It was a home Helena could never have imagined destroyed by her choices. They sat facing each other, 2 cups of tea between them, as if sharing a common grief. The other woman was direct. She said she'd known for a long time, that she'd discovered it through hidden messages on her husband's phone, that she'd confronted him, and that he'd denied it. She said she felt betrayed twice, by his infidelity and by his never confessing. Helena wanted to know why she'd written to Jonathan. The answer was simple, because he was the only one who didn't know anything. And he didn't deserve to continue being deceived. Helena asked if she'd separated. The woman nodded. She said she couldn't do it anymore. That forgiving was a possible choice, but trusting again, that was another matter. Helena nodded silently. She understood, then and there, that perhaps she wouldn't have been able to forgive either if the roles had been reversed. The next day, Jonathan received an unexpected message from Lara, Helena's friend who had told him everything. She simply wanted to know how he was doing. They spoke a few words, but at one point, she mentioned that Helena had gone after her lover's ex-wife. Jonathan was surprised. He hadn't imagined she would take that kind of initiative. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he couldn't define. It wasn't longing. It wasn't pity. It was a silent curiosity, a distant echo of the woman he once loved. Days later, he met Alicia again. She was with her daughter, a bright girl with restless eyes. The three of them talked for a while. Then, alone, she asked how he was handling everything. Jonathan hesitated, but decided to be honest. He told her, without excessive details, about the betrayal, the letter, and the revelation of the reason. Alicia listened silently, without judgment. When he finished, she said that every pain had its time to mature, but that she deeply admired the way he was handling everything. He smiled gratefully, and in that moment, for the first time, he felt that perhaps he was ready to try again. Not out of need, but out of deservingness. Helena, meanwhile, sat on a park bench, watching the sunset. Beside her lay the letter she had written to Jonathan. She hadn't intended to send it. It was a confession. It told him everything he would never know, that the man she'd been with had manipulated her from the start, that she'd let herself be fooled by her own needs, that she'd discovered, too late, how rare Jonathan was. She told him how she missed the comfortable silence that only he could provide, his discreet touch, his steady presence. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, nor a response. She just wanted him to know that, even though she'd lost herself, she recognized, with every fiber of her being, how much she'd hurt him. But she didn't send it. She burned the letter in her garden, watching the words turn to ash. It was her way of closing the cycle. 2 weeks later, Jonathan was invited to a get-together for former college classmates. Alicia encouraged him to go. She told him he needed to reconnect with parts of himself that existed before the trauma. He went. In the middle of the night, after some conversation and laughter, he bumped into an old teacher who, unaware of anything, commented on how he'd always been mature and centered, but that lately he seemed lighter, more enlightened. This stuck with him. Not because it was a major revelation, but because it confirmed what he was already beginning to feel: he was free. Not just from Helena, but from the weight of carrying everything on his shoulders for so long. One day, walking alone through a craft fair, he saw a painting that caught his eye. It was an abstract image, but somehow it reminded him of the chaos of what he had experienced. He bought the piece and hung it in his living room. Alicia, upon seeing it, said it suited his new phase. It was beautiful, yet intense. Like the scars he now carried without fear. Months later, Helena saw a photo of him and Alicia on a mutual friend's social media account. They were on a short trip to the countryside, smiling at a bucolic landscape. His smile was genuine, light, happy. She stared at that image for long minutes. Then she turned off her phone, lay down on the bed, and, for the first time, cried, not because she wanted to get back together, but because she finally understood that she had truly lost him. And that, of all the consequences of her betrayal, that was the most irreversible. But what neither she nor he knew, was that this story still held a final outcome. Something hidden between the lines of time, silent, patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Because sometimes, the true outcome doesn't come at the height of pain, but when we think everything has been said. And it is precisely at that moment that fate knocks on the door for the last time. Time passed with the slowness of gray days. After the definitive encounter between Jonathan and Helena, life, in its silent and relentless way, began to take on new contours for them both. There was something undeniably sealed in that conversation. No possibility of return. No emotional breach. The love that once united them was now sealed within a past history, shrouded in pain and learning, and transformed into a memory that no longer sought a place in the present. Jonathan continued his life with a lightness that came not from the absence of feelings, but from acceptance. He had learned to live with the memory without it destroying him, and this gave him new strength. He continued walking with his eyes open to what lay ahead, and no longer with his heart trapped in what was left behind. Alicia, with her serene presence and attentive gaze, had become a comforting constant in his routine. She didn't try to fill the void left by Helena. She didn't compete with memories. She was there for the now. The moments between them grew slowly, without pressure, with the naturalness of someone who respected each other's time. And perhaps that was precisely what made their relationship blossom so honestly. Jonathan didn't feel pressured, he didn't need to prove anything, he just lived. They began to share weekends, cook together, laugh at the little flaws. And, however discreet, the affection between them took root as something solid, something true. Helena, in turn, began to live in two parallel worlds. One, the one she displayed to others, where she tried to appear well, busy, involved in new projects, and seeking reinvention. The other, the silent one, was where her mind rested in moments of solitude, where the ghosts she avoided during the day returned with a vengeance. The pain no longer came with the intensity of the beginning, but was like an echo, ever present, reminding her of what she had lost. And even though she had understood the consequences of her choices, she faced an even crueler dilemma. How could she move forward knowing that her biggest mistake was not only cheating, but also ignoring for so long the value of what she had lost? Each new attempt at involvement with someone died before it even germinated, because, deep down, she didn't want a replacement. She didn't want a new love. She wanted what she had lost. And that cannot be recovered. One late afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes in the attic, Helena found a yellowed envelope with Jonathan's name handwritten on it. It was a letter he'd written for their 5th wedding anniversary, but which he'd never delivered. She recognized the handwriting immediately. His hands trembled as he carefully opened the paper. Reading it was a shock. He spoke of dreams, of plans, of how she inspired him every day. He spoke of the certainty of having found the person he wanted to grow old with. He said that, even through their disagreements, he felt they were growing together. Helen had to sit down. The tears came heavy, not from longing, but from guilt. Not from the betrayal itself, but from everything she'd failed to appreciate when she still could. That letter wasn't a request, it wasn't a gift. It was a portrait of the man she'd failed to care for. And there, alone in the dark, she felt that regret wasn't a moment. It was a process. One that might stay with her for the rest of her life. Jonathan, meanwhile, was facing a different kind of conflict. Alicia, who until then had been part of the reconstruction, began to reveal her own fears. She liked him, that was clear. But she was also coming from a relationship that hurt her, and although she hadn't experienced betrayal, she had been neglected for years. The two began to grow closer precisely because they shared deep wounds, but as their relationship progressed, a new fear emerged. Were they simply supporting each other to keep from falling apart, or was there a love there that could truly sustain the future? Jonathan found himself pondering this silently. He felt affection for Alicia, gratitude, affection, but he wondered if that would be enough. He wanted to avoid repeating history. And, above all, he wanted to protect himself and her from creating a new relationship based solely on the need to feel whole. One day, Alicia surprised him with an invitation to spend a few days at a friend's country house. A secluded spot, surrounded by nature, with no cell phone signal, no distractions. He accepted. He needed some time to himself. At the retreat, amidst trails, campfires, and the sound of rain on the porch, the two talked at length. It was there, in that simplicity, that they decided to give each other time. Not to break up, but not to force a direction. Jonathan thanked her for her honesty. She said it was better to face the truth now than to repeat past mistakes. They embraced. And in that embrace, there was something stronger than passion. There was respect. And that, for both of them, was already a lot. Meanwhile, Helena began writing. Diaries, chronicles, pieces of herself she'd never had the courage to share. She discovered through writing a way to confront her mistakes without needing external answers. One day, during a literature workshop at a small bookstore, she shared one of her texts. It was about a woman who loses her husband after cheating on him, and only understands the value of that man when she sees him happy in the arms of another. The room fell silent. No one commented, but everyone seemed to understand. It was raw, real, painful. For the first time, she felt that, even in pain, there was something to build. The seasons changed. Jonathan returned to work with more energy, began to engage in new projects, and took short trips alone, rediscovering pleasures he'd previously neglected. He wasn't trying to forget Helena, but remembering her no longer hurt. On one of these trips, he ran into an old college friend who invited him to a lecture on post-divorce emotional recovery. He declined, but remained thoughtful. Not because he felt he had something to teach, but because he realized how much he had changed. He was no longer the man who merely reacted. Now he was making choices. Including the choice to let go of the past. One random afternoon, Helena bumped into Alicia at a coffee shop. The initial awkwardness was inevitable, but Alicia, always elegant, gave a discreet wave and a slight smile. Helena, surprised, thanked her with a look. They didn't exchange words. But in that moment, there was a silent truce. As if they both recognized that they had loved the same man, but at different times. And that, despite everything, he had been fair to them both. And then, one ordinary day, Jonathan received a letter in the mail. No return address. Upon opening it, he recognized Helena's handwriting. It wasn't an apology. It was a letter of liberation. She said she finally understood that she no longer deserved a place in his life. But she needed to say one last thing, that she sincerely hoped he would be happy. And that, above all, she was grateful. Because even the pain he caused had made her grow. The letter ended by saying that this would be the last time he would hear her name. And that silence, this time, wouldn't be cowardly. It would be respectful. Jonathan read it, smiled slightly, and put the letter in a drawer. Then he went for his walk, as he did every day. The sky was clear, and the wind was light. For the first time, he felt completely at peace. Not because everything had been resolved, but because he had learned that some things don't need to be resolved. They just need to be accepted. But what he didn't expect was that his walk would be interrupted by a message that would change everything. One that came from long before. A piece of the past that had not yet been revealed. And now, it returned like the last echo of a story that seemed already over. That afternoon, when Jonathan returned from his usual walk, he found an email in his inbox that at first glance seemed like just another social media notification, until he noticed the sender's name. It was the same as an old childhood friend, someone he hadn't seen in decades, someone he hadn't even kept active contact with. And yet, there it was. The message's title was direct and cold, without any introduction, "You need to know this." He opened it with some disdain, without much expectation. But as he read, the content began to shape a new weight on his shoulders. The man explained that he had discovered something by chance during company research, analyzing data from a startup that had recently closed its doors. One of the founding partners of that company was the same man Helena had gotten involved with. Hearing that name again, Jonathan thought it would just be another wound being opened for no reason. But the email went further. In the following paragraphs, the sender explained that the company had gone bankrupt amid investigations into money laundering and tax fraud, and that those involved included a list of accomplices, including people close to the partners. One of the names associated with suspicious bank transactions was Helena's. Jonathan felt his body freeze. For a moment, he thought it was an empty accusation, a setup. But his colleague attached documents, bank records, conversations captured by authorities, all in organized files. There were transactions made from the joint account he and Helena had maintained until shortly before their divorce, funds sent to an offshore account he never knew existed. What stunned him most was not the number of zeros in the transactions, but the timing, all those transfers occurred during the final months of their marriage, on dates he remembered precisely because they coincided with episodes in which she claimed to be swamped with work, with no time, no energy for them. It wasn't just emotional or physical betrayal. It was something more serious, more cold. And his name, though not directly linked to anything, appeared on some authorizations because he was still one of the account holders. The past he thought he had overcome now returned in a different, more cunning and legally dangerous form. Sitting at the table, unable to move, Jonathan read and reread every line of the email. He knew he needed to think clearly, but the blood felt too heavy. He breathed heavily, amidst memories and indignation. At no point had Helena mentioned any of this, not even when they saw each other for the last time. Not even when she wrote that farewell letter so full of truths. And this was worse than all. The conscious omission. The premeditated silence. The possibility of having been used as a shield in something involving real crimes. He didn't know if she had been an accomplice or simply drawn in by naivete, but in both scenarios the truth was the same: she had drawn him, directly or indirectly, into an abyss that could still have consequences. In the following days, Jonathan consulted a trusted lawyer, explained the situation without naming names, and requested a technical analysis of the documents. Quietly, without even telling Alicia, who was traveling to visit her sister at the time, he began mapping everything out. He didn't want to confront Helena without concrete evidence, nor did he want to rush into accusations that could backfire. He needed to understand how far this could go. The lawyer confirmed that the documents were legitimate, that there were irregularities, and that, even without direct involvement, he could be called to testify if the case moved forward. Jonathan felt his body weaken at the thought of being dragged into another chapter of this. He was finally starting over, finally building something new. And there he was, trapped once again with a woman who had imploded his life. He tried to contact her. Once. He called her old number. It went to voicemail. He sent a single message: "I need to talk to you. I'm serious." No answer. So he decided to seek her out in person. He didn't want her to find out from others that he knew. He wanted to look her in the eyes. He wanted to understand if she was aware of what she had done or if it was just another consequence of the emotional storm they had been plunged into. He found her leaving a cultural center, with a group of women participating in a creative writing course. She was thinner, her hair shorter, her eyes tired. When she saw him, she froze. He asked to talk. She nodded. They walked in silence to a nearby bench. And there, he took a copy of the documents from his pocket. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse her. He simply held out the papers and asked if she knew what they were. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she tried to deny it, mumbling incoherent sentences. But when she saw that he already knew everything, she simply lowered her head. She said she'd been blackmailed for months. That the man she'd gotten involved with had also involved her in his business dealings. That he'd used her signature, her accounts, her influence to launder money. She said she tried to leave, but that she'd been threatened, that he'd claimed to have videos, audio, proof of everything. She said she didn't want to involve Jonathan, but that some of the transfers were made while they were still together because she had no choice. Jonathan interrupted her. She said she always had a choice. Even with threats, there's always a turning point. And that the fact she hadn't said anything, even when she had the chance to redeem herself, said more about her than any justification. Helena, crying, said she was lost, that she didn't know how to get out of that situation. She said she thought about disappearing, but was afraid of being arrested, of losing what little life she had left. Jonathan looked her in the eyes and said he could no longer help her. That he was no longer her safe haven. That the responsibility was now hers. But if he were subpoenaed in any case, he would tell the truth. Without protecting. Without exposing. Only the truth. He got up, said goodbye, and left. He didn't look back. When he got home, he found Alicia sitting on the porch. She'd returned from her trip. She looked at him fondly, but noticed something different in his gaze. Jonathan told her everything, from the email to the meeting with Helena. He held nothing back. Alicia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply asked, "Do you still have feelings for her?" He denied it, but hesitantly. He said it wasn't love, nor anger. It was just fatigue. Alicia held his hand and told him that when he truly wanted to leave all this behind, she would be there. But she wouldn't accept staying in a relationship that shared space with the ghosts of another woman. And in that moment, Jonathan understood he wasn't ready yet. He asked for time. Said he needed to resolve this within himself. Alicia simply nodded. She got up, kissed his forehead, and left. The following days were filled with silence and introspection. Jonathan avoided everything: work, social media, commitments. He spent hours writing, trying to sort through the feelings that jumbled together like shards of glass. He discovered that, no matter how much he had rebuilt his life, there was still a part of him that bled every time he heard Helena's name. And that wasn't fair. Not to him. Not to anyone who was arriving now. It was then that she decided to do something she had been putting off for a long time. She made an appointment with a therapist. He knew he could no longer handle everything alone. Not out of weakness, but out of maturity. It was time to understand why, even though he was free, he still felt trapped in a past that refused to die. In the first session, he spoke for almost an hour without stopping. The therapist listened attentively, without interrupting. When he finished, she simply said, "You've grown accustomed to saving. And now you need to learn not to drown trying to save those who choose to sink." That echoed in his mind for days. And for the first time, Jonathan felt that there was, indeed, a way out. But that it wouldn't come from outside. It would be a slow, solitary, necessary construction. And that perhaps the end of this story wouldn't be about revenge, or forgiveness, or reconciliation. Maybe it would simply be about freedom. On the other side, Helena received official notification about the opening of an inquiry. She knew Jonathan's name was listed as a witness. Her stomach churned. The only thing she still had hoped for was that he wouldn't lie. And she knew he wouldn't lie. But this also meant that, for the first time, there would be no protection. She was alone. And she would have to face the consequences of everything she'd done. No shortcuts. No excuses. And so, life went on. Jonathan, now quieter, more introspective, reevaluated what he wanted for himself. For the first time, he wasn't in love. Not with anyone. Not with Helena. Not with Alicia. He was learning to enjoy his own company. And that, for someone who had always given so much of himself, was the greatest victory he could achieve. But fate still had one last surprise in store. Something that would change, once again, the trajectory of everything he thought he was finally understanding. Because some stories, no matter how closed they seem, only find their end when they stop hurting. And this one hadn't yet. The outcome of this story began quietly, like everything that carries depth. There were no screams, no grand dramatic revelations on the surface, just the inevitable collision between the past that refused to die and the present that, try as he might, was still not free of the shadow of what had been experienced. Jonathan, in his internal reconstruction, became clear that it was not enough to move on physically, he needed to break the last emotional ties that still bound him to all that. After months of sessions with his therapist, he realized that his biggest mistake had not been loving Helena, but believing that love compelled him to save someone even when it meant sinking with them. When he finally understood this, something broke inside him, not with pain, but with liberation. It was as if the last shackle that bound him to the past had been undone. And for the first time, he felt no guilt for being well, no pity for those who hurt him, no doubt about his choices. There was simply peace. Alicia, after months apart, reconnected. Not with expectations, but with genuine affection for everything they had experienced. Jonathan welcomed her with a calm smile, without promises. They talked about the weather, the difficult days, the versions each of them had become after the storm. She said she was happy to see him whole. He thanked her for being part of the rebuilding process. They knew there was no longer an us, but there was respect and gratitude that would stand the test of time. That reunion didn't rekindle a flame, but it did provide a beautiful and true closure. Jonathan went his own way, and she, hers. Both more mature, more aware that some connections aren't eternal, but are essential while they last. Helena, even as the legal process progressed silently, still believed she could maintain control over the fragments of her life. For a time, she tried to avoid hearings, hired lawyers, and moved. But the past, when left unaddressed, always finds a way to resurface with greater force. When the case finally gained notoriety because it involved other companies, Helena was officially summoned to testify. Her image associated with a financial scandal spread quickly among former colleagues, clients, and circles she had once proudly frequented. Doors closed without much warning. It wasn't just justice knocking on her door, it was the weight of all the neglected choices over the years. She lost contracts, lost friends, and lost the trust even of her family. The name that once carried professional respect was now followed by distrust. During the interrogation, the prosecutor asked her coldly, "Do you regret what you did, or do you just regret being found out?" This broke her insides. For a moment, she considered lying, manipulating, as she had done so many times. But she couldn't. She said she regretted everything, especially using the name of someone who only offered her love to cover up a mistake. He said he didn't deserve forgiveness, nor acquittal. And perhaps that was her first truth in a long time. She was sentenced, not to a long sentence, but enough to shatter any remnants of her self-image. She left the courtroom without anyone looking at her, without company, without protests. Just her and reality. There, Helena understood that the consequence of betrayal was not only losing the love of her life, but also losing herself along the way. Meanwhile, Jonathan began to live with a new lightness. He moved to a smaller, quieter town, where he opened a small bookstore cafe. Something he'd always dreamed of but never had the courage to do. The space became a meeting place for people seeking refuge in art, reading, and the comfortable silence of those who understand that time heals, but only after teaching. I wasn't looking for a new love. I didn't need one. He discovered that being at peace with himself was the most lasting love he could find. He kept in touch with a few friends, wrote articles on emotional health, and gave short lectures on overcoming obstacles without ever setting himself up as an example, only as someone who had learned from his experience. His gaze, previously always attentive to the signals of others, now also turned inward. There was no longer any need to prove anything to anyone. Not Helena. Not Alicia. Not even himself. The last trace of that story arrived one rainy afternoon, when a young man entered his bookstore looking for a rare book. Talking to the boy, he discovered he was the son of the ex-wife of the man Helena had cheated on him with. The boy said his mother had mentioned Jonathan once as someone deserving of respect, someone who, even after being betrayed, remained honest. Jonathan smiled discreetly, took the book from the shelf, and, as he handed it over, simply said, "I hope it helps you find what you're looking for, without shortcuts." The boy nodded, paid, and left. Jonathan stared out the window at the rain in silence. Life, somehow, had found a way of stitching together endings. Helena served her sentence in a semi-open prison. She worked in a public library, organizing books and cataloging stories that weren't hers. And there, ironically, was where she rediscovered herself. In the silence of the pages, in the stories of pain and redemption she read among dusty shelves, she learned to live with who she had become. She didn't try to start over with anyone, nor regain what she lost. She simply learned to live with the shadow of it. She wrote a book, under a fictitious name, telling her story. A sincere account of how you lose everything when you choose to lie to yourself. The book was read by few people, but it touched those who did deeply. One reader wrote in a review, "I've never seen myself so clearly in a mistake." Thank you for showing me that regret, even belatedly, is still human. That was enough for Helena. Not to feel forgiven, but to feel that, at least, her pain had generated something other than destruction. Jonathan never knew about the book. And even if he had, he might not have wanted to know. His life was now made up of small gestures. A well-made coffee, a sincere conversation with a customer, a sunset scene from the bookstore counter. He was happy, not because everything was perfect, but because there was nothing left pending. He forgave not with words, but with choices. And that made all the difference. His name didn't become famous, his story didn't make headlines, but it became a living lesson in dignity. In the value of not retaliating with the same venom. In the strength that arises in those who choose to carry on, even while bleeding. And so, this story comes to an end. A story that showed, starkly, the price of betrayal. It showed how a selfish choice can destroy not only a love, but also everything built around it. How trust, once broken, cannot be restored with promises or tears. And how the truth, however painful, is the only path that doesn't condemn us to eternal regret. If you've made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. Share your opinion, it's very important. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories. Here, every week, you'll hear real or fictional stories that carry hard but necessary truths. And remember, betrayal is not just a mistake, it is a choice that exacts a very high price that it destroys homes, corrodes souls, and erases entire futures. This channel will never condone any kind of betrayal. Our goal is to show, through stories like this, that true love shouldn't be betrayed, it should be protected. Until next time. And think carefully before turning your back on someone who offered you their whole heart.